Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Fun House alongside my good friend from up in Canada, Mr. Martin Popoff. Greetings, my
Absolutely.
friend.
How you doing? Gonna talk some new wave British heavy metal today. Very
We
cool.
are, yes, yes. Martin and I last week were, as we generally do after each episode, we powwow for a little bit to kind of like the production meeting, like what are we going to do next week type of thing. And Martin's like, you want to talk about new wave of British heavy metal again? We haven't done that in a while, and that's true. We have not. I think it's been almost 2 years since we did our kind of definitive top 10 list of the new wave of British heavy metal albums. So Martin came up with another idea about, and you could do this on any genre or subgenre of music, about this whole bike wheel concept. And we decided to kick it all off with the new wave of British heavy metal. I'm going to let Martin kind of extrapolate on that a little bit because I think it's a pretty cool concept. And we're going to talk about 5 albums that we think make up the hub of the new wave of British heavy metal sound. So, Martin, you want to expand on that a little bit because this is a little tricky, I think.
Yeah, I've done something similar to this in my audio podcast, History in 5 Songs. And then what happened recently was I've been doing these Brave Words shorts, and there was some Def Leppard milestone anniversary, and I just we titled it a little clickbaity like is On Through the Night the quintessential new wave of British heavy metal album, and it always causes a firestorm of debate, especially when you bring up Def Leppard, given Joe Elliott's disowning of being a new wave of British heavy metal band, and that because I always make the point that that album is right. So the idea is basically this: you've got a bike wheel, and at the hub you've got the center of any given genre, and with new wave of British heavy metal, the idea is that we're going to explore is what albums sound like the mean median average of new wave of British heavy metal, like absolutely this sounds perfectly like what you would think about when you think of new wave of British heavy metal. And then off that bike wheel, off that hub, come spokes, and in all directions, and again with any genre this is the case, in all directions you travel up the spokes, and you find things that are more AOR, more dirtier, more speedier, more punky, more doomy, for new wave of British heavy metal. So those are not at the hub. So the idea here, very different from what we did before, where we were listing our top albums. This is literally, well, what are 5 albums we've picked that absolutely define the sound, and we're not saying these are the best ones or anything. We're just
Correct.
saying that they're the most new wave of British heavy metal albums.
Yeah, and that's a great way to get started on this. And there were other albums other than the 5 that we talked about that may be more notorious as some of the great albums in this genre or subgenre, but they're not necessarily poster childs or poster children for the sound of the new wave of British heavy metal. And I think that besides the music, and again, we're more talking about albums here than bands, but these bands with these albums, there's characteristics that they all had, whether it be there's obviously the musical aspect of it. There's kind of the look of the band, the attitude of the band, were they releasing singles before the albums? I mean, there's all these little things that go into what makes a new wave of British heavy metal band. And I think all of these groups, no matter when in that couple of year period that we're going to be talking about, when they release these albums, the ultimate end result is that album firmly, in our opinion, emblazons all that is the new wave of British heavy metal. Like if you were going to say to someone who has no clue what the new wave of British heavy metal is, what an album is, what a band is, anything like that, I would be safe to say that any of these 5 records, even though a few of them differ from each other, but they all have those characteristics that we're talking about, and they all really, really exemplify this whole thing that we're talking about. And these would be great examples to give to someone. Say, listen to this album, there's 5 of them. Listen to these 5 albums, and you'll have a pretty clear understanding of what the new wave of British heavy metal movement was all about, right? I mean, that's kind of what we're getting at here.
For sure.
So we have 5 albums. We're going from 1980 to 1983 here. We have one from 80, one from 81, one, actually, where is it? Two from 81.
I think we have two from 80.
Two from 80, one from 81 and two from 83. Getting all my years confused here. So I'll have Martin kick us off with the first one, which is going to be Iron Maiden, self-titled from 1980.
Yeah, there's a vinyl copy of that. So essentially Maiden fits in here, but not all Maiden. So part of my thing when I get into these Facebook, debates with people about this is I would like say things are up the spoke a little when it has too much personality. So with Maiden, I think as Bruce joins, and then when Nico joins, Maiden has so much interesting personality to what they're doing that they now have a little bit of eccentricity and they're a little further off the sound. And plus they're developing and they're turning in a lot of albums and they're all great albums. But the first one fits really well because it's the recording isn't that great. So that's one thing. Like not all of these have the same things in common, but a lot of them have a lot of the characteristics. So one thing about the new wave of British heavy metal, arguably, is that a lot of stuff was done on a shoestring budget and the recordings are not that great. So this first one's kind of lacking a little bit in the bass department. It's a little loose. They tighten up later on, certainly by Peace of Mind. But this is a band that also is, this is an album that is kind of quintessential. It's ground zero. It's considered one of the greatest of this genre, but it is a defining band. They have the Soundhouse Tapes EP. They're on Metal for Mothers, one with 2 tracks, the only band to be on with 2 tracks. And they come out with this sound that is, it's an absolutely heavy sound, but it is related to Judas Priest, which I argue that Judas Priest is probably the quintessential. If you had to pick one influence on this genre, it'd probably be Priest. So this is, I always describe Maiden in the beginning as basically punky Judas Priest or loose bolts Judas Priest. And then the other thing is, you get with that album cover and with the back cover both, you get the whole idea of bands actually saying that we love metal by showing you a metal package and saying, what's inside is what's pictured on the tin, kind of thing, right? And here you get the start of illustration, you get the great live shot, you get the scary song titles. So as we've argued before, with a lot of heavy metal from the past, all of these things, a lot of this stuff, there is not much of a connection. And as you get towards this genre, you start getting the entire package all in one place. So again, I'll argue that on this obscure point about the bike wheel and the hub and all that, is that the sound of this album, of all of them, and they progressively get further away or further up a spoke, but not very far up a spoke. This album, I think, exemplifies it the most.
Yeah, I would agree. And you brought up a really good point earlier, which I think is we will see the examples of it in all of these bands as they kind of get on, either with their follow-up album or certainly the ones after that. By the time Bruce and Nico joined the band, with Number of the Beast and Peace of Mind, the sound of Maiden changed drastically. All of a sudden, much better production, much better songwriting, arranging, and whatnot. Not necessarily better or worse, but very different. There is on this album, there is a brashness. There's you have almost these kind of punk style vocals from Paul Di'Anno, right? Because there's that punk aesthetic that I think runs through at least a few of these bands and albums we're going to talk about today. There's the kind of horror movie tropes and lyrical themes that a lot of these bands, tend to kind of latch onto. You've got the twin guitars, right? You've got this kind of gothicness about it, which, this darkness, which is really interesting. They had the look, right? A lot of these bands, the leather, the spiked bracelets, the spiked, around the neck, the belts, all that sort of thing, the bullet belts, all that kind of stuff. Most of these bands were releasing singles even before they released these albums. They found their way on compilations. And the songs are all very, very raw. This is a really raw production, and I think the production part of it, cannot be understated. That a lot of these classic albums, they have this kind of cavernous raw production, which I think is part of the appeal. And with Maiden, I think you mentioned the whole Priest thing, And I absolutely agree. And then I think that Maiden then took that influence from Priest. They created this new sound. And then you had a lot of other bands that were kind of taking what Maiden were doing and kind of running with it from there. So I think, I don't know, to me, this is almost like the new wave of British heavy metal poster child right here.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, there's arguments for some of the others we're going to be talking about, but to me, this is probably like the granddaddy of all of them. And
yeah, and arguably, you know, you even get up to Power Slave, which is 1984. You know, which so I did this trilogy of new wave of British heavy metal books, right? So this is, and you know, one of these is all the records reviewed. So 900 new wave of British heavy metal records reviewed, record meaning a lot of singles in it as well. But when you get up to the last one, this one, I ended it in 1984. So basically Maiden is still part of the new wave of British heavy metal as the new wave of British heavy metal is ending, according to me, right? 1984, right? But the funny thing about Maiden is that they never stopped making new wave of British heavy metal albums. They're still making them. They even sound more new wave of British heavy metal than Saxon does. Now, so that's the crazy thing. Like, this is the by far the biggest band from all this, and they're actually the band that deviated the least from it. You know, I always argue, you know, it's somewhat of a dig, but it's sort of true that basically after Peace of Mind, every Iron Maiden album sounds the same. That's their sound. They discovered their sound. They really didn't deviate from it very much anymore. And it has a lot to do with Nico coming into the band and just solidifying a whole bunch of things. But I remember feeling that about Power Slave. But yeah, so the cool thing as well, Maiden is so poster child because they just got this great string of albums. What is it? 5 albums that they put out in the new wave of British heavy metal proper, which is incredible.
Yeah.
Is it 5? 1, 2? Yeah, 5. And you know, everybody thinks those are the 5 greatest Iron Maiden albums, essentially, right?
Pretty much. Yeah. Pretty much.
So,
yeah. It really wasn't until somewhere in time that all of a sudden they started to add new elements to the music that maybe kind of took it out of that just a little bit. But that's by then the new wave of British heavy metal. Nobody's talking about that anymore. Right. Yeah. It's just metal. It's just British metal. It's all. It's not new anymore. All right, so we're going to move on. Also in that year, we've got Def Leppard On Through the Night, which, like Martin explained, you know, the guys in the band kind of disowned their involvement in this whole movement. There's even a lot of metal and hard rock fans who don't consider Def Leppard part of this whole movement, but they absolutely were. Granted, you've got an album here that very different from this. All right, so there's no horror movie serial killer lyrics, and there's no darkness to this one. You definitely do have the dual guitar attack, which I think is very, very important. But whereas I think that Maiden kind of took their influence from, you know, Priest or Sabbath and all that, Deep Purple and whatnot, Def Leppard's coming from more of a hard rock school of things, right, as opposed to the metal aspect of it. You've got more like kind of anthemic songs on here. They still got the look down, right? Still, you know, here we got the jeans and the leather and right, the tough guy attitude, the headbands, all that kind of stuff. But this to me is more kick-ass heavy rock music, and no real punk influence here either. But, you know, very singable songs, crunchy guitars, much better production. That's the one thing I think out of all the ones we're talking about today, this is the one that's got the kind of real mature production for a debut album, and certainly for a lot of the bands in this early part of this movement. This is one of the best sounding albums, I think. But, you know, you got Rock Brigade, Hello America, you know, Sorrow's a Woman, Wasted. I mean, all really good, memorable anthems, Rocks Off, really, really good stuff. Produced by a guy who has the ties to Judas Priest, Tom Allen, right? But yet again, they don't sound anything like that. So, yeah, this definitely belongs for me because I think there's another band we're going to talk about next who I think kind of fell in this wake a little bit as opposed to the Maiden wake. So you've got other bands that follow along with this kind of style, even after Def Leppard moves on from it really, really quickly. And they did move on from it really, really quickly. You could argue onto High and Dry carries over a little bit, but then once the third album comes out, you know, they're not lumped in here at all anymore. But the fact that they do have one that firmly sits in here, I think, is absolutely correct, and it needs to be discussed here. So I'll let Martin kind of take it from there.
Yeah, and just to, you know, backtrack a little bit. I mean, the Iron Maiden, I usually like put that up against the first Angel Witch album, which I think is a better album. And I think for a brief moment there, they were a better band. It was like Angel Witch could have gotten bigger and better. That's my favorite new wave British heavy metal album, but they are absolutely way up a spoke because they're doomier and satanic and stuff, and it doesn't fit. But back to Def Leppard, it's funny. I was thinking, so the big problem with this one, or the big interesting thing about this one that causes a lot of dispute, is because Joe Elliott has disavowed, being, all his metal influences, and it's all glam influences, and Mott the Hoople and David Bowie and all that. We know that's nonsense. But you mentioned like it's moving a little away from the Judas Priest thing. But then I got to thinking, okay, so who's Pete going to mention? And is it Thin Lizzy? Is it UFO? But the fact of the matter is, still, even though this is, this is not Judas Priest in the same way Iron Maiden is Judas Priest, still with the riffs and the lineup and all that stuff, I can't think of an influence that is even closer than Judas Priest to this. I mean, Judas Priest is more adjacent to this than even Thin Lizzy is, right?
Maybe late 70s Judas Priest as opposed to earlier in the decade.
Exactly. Yes. Right? Yeah. Right at the end. And in fact, it's more like British Steel Judas Priest, and they're happening at the same time, sort of thing. But yeah, the mark against this being so new wave of British heavy metal is that the production is pretty good, and the second mark is they're on a major label. So the other thing we think about is those small labels, or coming out indie, or even like the sub imprints. But MCA was well involved in this, and here we have Polygram, which feels really weird. I think the name of the band is pretty new wave of British heavy metal, and they have the Rocks Off EP, and they have singles before this. So essentially, I agree that basically, and the idea, I always say that, to be closer to the hub, it's like if you have too much personality, you're off in a different direction. Just like bands with a lot of personality are off in weird directions, like the Who, in various ways, right? So this album really doesn't have a lot of personality to it. It's just this, baby metal band. It's here. The lyrics are whatever, the vocals are whatever, the production's great, the riffs are great. It's just a band, and you don't think, wow, that is some strange stuff they're doing. There's nothing strange about it, right? And then So High and Dry is definitely a little off the sound, but lots more personality. And that's why we love it more than the debut. And then the next one has even more personality, and it's a little further away, off on a spoke. So both of those are off on a spoke, but this one I always like pushing back and saying, look, this is Joe, this is as new wave of British heavy metal as anything out there, sort of thing. So there you go.
Yeah. Cool. All right. That'll lead us into the third one, Martin. So that's Tygers of Pan Tang.
You want me to do that one?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the second album I always think comes, immediately to mind. There's a band looking absolutely like a new wave of British heavy metal band. The only thing missing is a Japanese Rising Sun shirt. There's none in that picture. But we got John Sykes over there. Where is he? Over here. So we got John Sykes autograph on that one. So what I like about picking this is it's really illustrative of this idea, because this, is more magically in the pocket of the new wave of British heavy metal. It came out in 1980, but it's got Jess Cox singing on it, which, brings up an opportunity to make the point that, having a closer to a Rob Halford type singer makes you a little more, standard new wave British heavy metal. And John Deverell, when he takes over the band, goes that way. And the other thing is the riffs on this album are a little more Hellbent for Leather, Killing Machine, On Through the Night than they are on the first one. The first one's a little more, it's got just 15% more 70s in it, and it's definitely punkier and rougher and stuff. So I would argue that the debut album is it sounds early. It sounds like a late 79 album in this thing, but this one in 81 is absolutely mean median average. It's basically a slightly rougher version of On Through the Night.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So again, another album here in this discussion that doesn't take that whole kind of like horror, darker tone, lyrical theme thing. Okay, this is much more of a twin guitar, whether you're talking about getting it from, Thin Lizzy or Priest or what have you, the speedy arrangements, right? Definitely with John Sykes on board, the arrangements and the riffs are getting much more metallic than the debut. Lots of killer guitar solos. The drumming is fast and frantic, high-pitched vocals. Absolutely. I think, here they got the ripped jeans, the leather jackets approach, as opposed to the spike bracelets and all that other stuff, I think. So again, more of like the kind of the hard rock aspect of the new wave of British heavy metal. But killer songs. I mean, just go listen to tracks like Gangland, Minotaur, and Hellbound. I mean, just these are just kick-ass. You can tell it's a young band. You can tell they're British. You can tell they're doing something a little bit different. They take their influences, they're running with it, and I think they really started to change their sound, I think, with the follow-up album and all the albums after that. But this is the one that, to me, that always kind of, and whether it's your favorite or not doesn't really matter, because I love Crazy Nights. I think that's probably my favorite album. But I agree, This is the one that really fits into this discussion. This is the one that's at the center of it all, at the center of that wheel. So
yeah, and the production's a little more mid-rangey. It's lacking a little bass. It's lacking a little treble. May he rest in peace, Chris Tangerides. He made other albums that sounded much better than this even, but the production's not anything particularly to write home about. It's good, but it's not On Through the Night good, which is Tom Allen. So
yeah, correct. Yep. All right, so we're going to move up to 1983. I think we said August 1983. So we're at the tail end of things now. So we've had lots of other, and for those watching, there's probably other bands that we're not going to mention, but those are on the spokes there, right? There's plenty of other bands that came out that maybe had more notoriety than some of these bands. But again, we're looking at the kind of the genesis, the essence of the new wave of British heavy metal sound. And so Satan, Court, and the Act is the next choice here, again, from August of 1983. So again, we're looking at the tail end of the new wave of British heavy metal. These guys are from Newcastle. This band took that, again, this is one of the ones that goes back to this, right? So here you've got the dark imagery, obviously the name of the band, right? Not going to win them any awards for, most appealing to, the masses, right? But along with other bands like Demon and Witchfind and Angel Witch, right? Taking that darker tone here. But, this has that kind of a little bit of punky vibe. It's got the dueling guitars. It's got that priestness to it. You got very early kind of depictions of speed metal here, I think, on this particular album, which a lot of these new wave of British heavy metal bands kind of dove into. We usually look at speed metal, creation of speed metal, and we there's all sorts of other bands, like we look at a lot of the German bands. That's where speed metal was created. I'd argue that a lot of speed metal, the genesis, came from the new wave of British heavy metal. This band was doing a lot of that. You've got the really high-pitched vocals of Brian Ross, really, really excellent. Okay. Like I said, there's that kind of late 70s punk drive going on here. The songs have like an epic feel to them. The production, really raw. I mean, this production is extremely raw. And I think it almost became a signature of the band, because they've reformed all these years later. They think they've got 4 studio albums they put out in the last decade and a half. And they continue to kind of have their albums sound like this. Like they have a really raw kind of cavernous production. And I think it's become their sound. But, you look back on, I don't think I have a picture of them here, no other than that, but, they had the look, right? They had the grimy, long-haired kind of punks right from the UK. They wore all the leather and chains and all that kind of stuff. They were also releasing singles before they put out their first album. They had Kiss of Death came out as a single, Heads Will Roll, before this album was even released. So they were doing all the things that a lot of these young bands were doing. They looked the part, they sounded like the part. And while this is not one of the, better known albums from this, this movement, I think they really fit very well if you're going to explain to someone what the new wave of British heavy metal is all about. What it sounds like, put this on and you'll get a good idea of it.
Yeah, that's a great analysis. And I would add the this abstract thing of you could tell they really understand metal and they've soaked up what's happened in the previous 3 years, right? 80, 81, 82. So these guys love metal. You can tell there's some really good riffs in there. They also give a little bit of the eccentricities, like it is a little doomy. And it's funny, this whole topic of speed metal, part of this debate is people would say, no, I'm going to pick Raven Wiped Out or Rock Till You Drop as the mean median average, something that belongs at the hub that sounds very, very much. But and then I commented that basically Well, that takes away from their more important role as one of the first speed metal bands in a way, right? So they have speediness to them as well.
Yeah.
But so many other things about them are part of this, being on Neat Records and putting out all those singles and stuff as well. But yeah, that's a great choice. And here we are at the tail end of it. Being at the tail end of it might take a little bit of a way, because then you start getting into that big debate that everybody loves talking about, is when does this thing end, right? So, I allowed into kind of 84 kind of thing. And then it's just like dissipates. There is no more British metal for a long time that anybody talks about. It's funny.
Right.
Yeah.
Does it end when all the more noteworthy bands in this little subgenre become so big that it's not like this little underground movement anymore? I think that's kind of the way we look at it, right?
Well, it also there's a big drop in output, but also you get MTV in the start of hair metal, and then you get these bands trying to break America, and they change their sound too, right? Like Saxon is a perfect example of them changing around this time, right?
Yeah.
They go Power and the Glory, Crusader, and then boom, they're off, kind of thing. So yeah, it ends when that big spotlight. It's a little spotlight. It's kind of an underground spotlight for the new wave British heavy metal, but it gets much bigger and brighter when it moves over to California and shines on Dokken and Great White and Rat. And then that whole thing takes over. But yeah, you talk about the door closing. It closes harder on the new wave of British heavy metal than it does even on hair metal with grunge coming.
For sure, because they had most of the rest of the decade to kind of get to that point. Whereas we're only talking a couple short years here, and how many of these noteworthy bands didn't even make it out of those couple of years, right? A lot of them broke up, or they changed their name, changed their sound, and that was that.
Yeah. All right, what's our last one?
All right, Tokyo Blade, self-titled debut from late 83. So this is right at the end of the year. So I'll have Martin get us started on this one, and we'll comment on this one.
Yeah, so this is almost a little bit of a situation where I almost feel like we're getting a mean median average band in a little bit of a negative sense, in that it's like when Poison and Cinderella and some of those bands started being like the replicated example of the early stuff, or the improvement on the early hair metal, or whatever, however you want to define it, right? So at this point, you've got a band that's late in the tooth, late to arrive. It's a little bit like the Exodus album arriving a little late for thrash, right? So they're arriving a little late. And already it's what they're doing has kind of been done already with your Def Leppards and your Tygers of Pan Tang, but it really fits in that wheelhouse. So what you get actually is a really good, solid album. And they're ticking off all the boxes, right? The vocals are good, the production's pretty good. They've had a long lead up with some singles and stuff, but they're arriving a little late. But you're getting this quality album, but you're not that absolutely thrilled about it or impressed, because you feel like there's been so many other albums, and now there are albums with all this personality along the way. So Tokyo Blade kind of fell into that. It's just a really good, solid album for the first one, really good, solid album for the second one. And then they're actually hanging around making similar music when the new wave of British heavy metal's over. They're one of the few bands doing that. Even Satan came back with Suspended Sentence 4 years later, right?
Yeah,
kind of thing. But yeah, so this is a mean median average band. Probably wondering a little bit at this point. Maybe we're now about to ride the coattails on famous Def Leppard rather than the original Def Leppard. They seem to be a band that would have been poised to possibly make that hair metal move, but they didn't really. So.
No, yeah, I think with their second album, this is their debut. With their second album, it's a little bit more accessible. But yeah, I mean, I agree. I think they had all the tools here. There's great dual lead guitar work, right? The drumming is off the charts good. Great vocals. The songs are pretty accessible. I mean, like Power Game, really good metal track. Break the Chains, If Heaven is Hell. There's a little bit of the darkness in some of the lyrics, but for the most part, they kind of take the Tygers of Pan Tang, Def Leppard school of thought on this. Liar's a really good song. They had the look, right? They had the long hair, spike bracelets and belt. They carried swords and things. So it was this was totally like part of that whole time period. You know, they came from Salisbury. They were releasing all sorts of singles. But you know, after that second album, it's like, was anybody talking about Tokyo Blade anymore? Not really. But you listen to it and you're like, it just kind of takes you back to that time period. And it's like perfect representation of what some of these young bands were doing at the time. So yeah, definitely good stuff. Definitely good. So all these are really good. And maybe kind of in closing, we should probably maybe talk a little bit about some of the bands that we didn't consider for this, because I think they move a little bit away. Like, people are gonna be like, why isn't Saxon in this discussion?
Yeah.
Right. And to me, Saxon are absolutely a part of this. They're one of the greatest bands from this movement. But I think Saxon always had a little too much personality right from the get-go. Right, their first album, kind of sort of doesn't fit here, and then you have those next three albums, you know, Wheels of Steel, Denim and Leather, and whatnot, that are so signature for this time period. But to me, I don't know if Saxon always represented what the whole movement were all about from a musical perspective. They were kind of like their own thing, right? Yeah. So that's why I think we both immediately were like, no, we're not going to put Saxon in this little kind of hub thing right here.
Exactly. And you know, and then Motorhead is so far down a spoke that when you start having that explosion of comments, it's you get into the massive debate, do Motorhead even you know, belong anymore, right? You know, I totally believe they do, and I get in these arguments all the time. But so they're way down a spoke even farther than Saxon. Saxon, it's a little bit the vocals, a little bit the 70s sound and what they're doing, a little bit, you know, I consider Saxon a little closer to Kiss because of the simplicity of the riffs that they're doing, the traditional meat and potatoesness of them. But so you've got Witchfinder General down the doom spoke. You've got Tank and Warfare and maybe some Avenger and Tyson Dog down that Motorhead dirty new wave of British heavy metal spoke, right? The biker rock thing. You've got Holocaust that sound like, you know, bedheaded Dennis the Menace punky guys. You've got Witchfind, which looks really satanic, but it's kind of poppy sometimes. You've got Demon and Saracen and Limelight, and those bands who were a little bit proggy.
Praying Mantis too, yeah.
Proggy and pop, and Praying Mantis and White Spirit, who are a little keyboardy. And then you've got the whole you know, you've got the whole AOR side of it with the likes of what are they called, Shy. You've got Wrathchild, you know, the Motley Crue end of it, right? You've got Hellenbach, you know, the Baby Van Halens. You've got a little even Baby Van Halen band in here, right? And you know, Gaskin and Fist are a little kind of 70s and, you know, just not all that skilled, I guess. You know, they're not writing forward thinking, heavy technical riffs as often, sort of thing. Dark Star sounded a little 70s, I remember. And we're talking albums here, you know, singles is a whole nother thing, because there's piles of the singles bands that sound perfect for this as well. Yeah. I think the one band that's probably going to get the most argument for being a part of this discussion is an album is the first Angel Witch album. We thought about that. But Martin's correct. There is a kind of real dark and doomy nature to some of the stuff on that debut album. And while it may be one of the signature albums of the new wave of British heavy metal, whether it should be at the hub or not is debatable. Right. Yeah. And I love the Courts, Stand Up and Fight, and Even Against All Odds. I love the second More album, Blood and Thunder. They're always up my list. Way up my list is always Savage, Loose and Lethal. But all of these have way too much personality to be at the hub. That they're not faceless enough to be right there, or all the ingredients together, sort of thing. They've got some interesting, different, cool things about it. Even Grim Reaper, with just somehow that careening, forward, compelling, and so much personality in Steve's vocals. So there's a whole bunch of albums that I personally like more, and they would be way up my list. And I guess go look at our old episode from a couple of years back or whatever, right? Yeah. But yeah, I always like this, and then you get down the honorary thing. Gillan is one that everybody's like, oh, do they belong, right? Because having an old guy in it. But again, it's often about singles and picture sleeves and colored vinyl and patches and all that stuff, and 12-inch versions of the singles and stuff. So there's a lot of reasons to be part of this. And just to reemphasize, Tokyo Blade, the big thing is the rising sun look, right? The
Yeah.
Japanese shirt, which is always one of the amusing tropes of the new wave British heavy metal. So.
Yeah, big time, big time. Yeah, you see lots of pictures of them from back in the day, and they got wearing all this stuff, these jerseys and things. It's quite kind of comical, but pretty cool. So there you have it, everybody. Let us know what you think of this concept, because man, there's like no shortage of shows we can do based off of this whole theme. So this whole the bike wheel thing. So Martin and I were talking about a couple of ideas last week that we could go here. So yeah. So Martin, what's new on your end as everybody's recovering from Thanksgiving Day turkey here in the States? What you got coming up this weekend?
Yeah,
we can watch. And
well, let's see. I guess there's the History in 5 Songs podcast, and the last one of that. So let's see. I had Title Track Weirdness. Oh yeah, the Snow Globe Bands one. Yeah, so that's the one that just went up. Snow Globe Bands. And yeah, the books are all at martinpopoff.com. There's the new deal, the Coopers, the David Bowie, those are the recent ones, and our Contrarians. Actually, we just put up the Symbol Remains as a panel discussion of Blue Oyster Cult Symbol Remains.
A really, really good album. Yeah. I'd like to see some more love for the Symbol Remains, because I love it. One of the great kind of comeback albums of the last decade or so. Yeah. Great stuff. So there you have it, everybody. Another episode of Friday Morning Funhouse in the books. Tune in tomorrow for the UK connection. Simon Bray, Stephen Reed, and myself will be ranking the songs on another classic album. That album is Led Zeppelin 4. Simon Bray's favorite album of all time. No, it's not. So that's coming up tomorrow. And then on Sunday, stay tuned for Ranking the Albums. Rich Catino and I are ranking the catalog of Stryper. Long awaited, finally coming. So that'll be happening this Sunday. And then we kick off the work week with the Hudson Valley Squares on Monday. So thanks for watching, everybody. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube. All together, all the damn time. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Thanks for watching. See you next Friday, everybody. Have a great weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.